Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's session of Maxwell Lectures, and thank you for joining us. I am Mi-Sung from Maxwell Chambers, your host for today. Let me introduce our guest speaker today, Mr. Duncan Matthews QC. After graduating from Magdalen College, Oxford, Duncan was called to the English bar in 1986 and took silk in 2002 to become Queen's Counsel. He has served as head of chambers for Twenty Essex for the past 8 years. Duncan is a leading trial advocate with a broad practice covering international and domestic commercial dispute resolution in the English higher courts and oversees both in litigation and in international commercial arbitration. He is ranked by the major legal directories for shipping and commodities, construction, energy and infrastructure, commercial litigation, energy and natural resources, civil fraud, and international arbitration as a counsel and as arbitrator. He has a large international arbitration practice, which involves him acting as counsel and also accepting appointments as arbitrator. In addition, Duncan is a registered foreign lawyer with the Singapore International Commercial Court, SICC. He is also admitted to the bars of the British Virgin Islands, the Turks and Caicos Islands ad hoc, the Cayman Islands ad hoc, St. Kitts and Nevis ad hoc, and the East Caribbean Supreme Court. We're certainly looking forward to hearing from him today. Let me introduce Duncan on the screen. Over to you, Duncan.
Thank you very much, Mi-Sung, and greetings to all of you in whatever jurisdiction and time zone you may be joining us from. It's a great honor to be invited by Maxwell Chambers to give this webinar today. It does, however, fill me with trepidation. Nearly 800 people from around 30 jurisdictions signed up to hear me speak today. And when I last looked, over 400 had actually joined us. I'm even more disturbed at the seniority of some of those attending. My presentation is aimed primarily at those in their early years of legal practice to encourage and reassure them that whatever disasters they encounter, the likelihood is their seniors will have experienced much the same, and the solution is to be informed by their reverses, to learn from them, not to hide from them, and not to be discouraged by them. My talk is described as discussing a career at the bar. For those hoping to hear about a career as a waiter or barista in a bar, then I fear you may be even more disappointed than the rest of my audience by the ensuing discussion. When I touch, as I will, on some of the broader issues impacting our working lives today, I will do so not in any great depth or necessarily with any great answers, but with a view to stimulating recognition of and thought about some of the issues facing us as we forge our careers as lawyers today. I'm sorry not to be present in Singapore in person, a case I was due to argue there, regrettably for all but the clients, settled, but I hope to be there in person before the end of the year and to catch up with some of you then. That said, I contemplated postponing this talk when my case settled so that I could present this talk to you in person. Then I was told that at that point, whilst over 300 people were signed up to attend remotely, those signed up to attend in person amounted to a mere 3. To those 3, if you are out there in the audience today, my apologies, but I hope to see you in person later in the year. Sorry also not to be sharing PowerPoints with you. It is not a talk that really lends itself to support with slides, and whilst it was suggested that it might be illustrated with photos of me, you have been saved that due to a combination of uncharacteristic modesty on my part and the fact that whilst we restore our house in the country, all my photo albums are in storage. And you have therefore been saved the photo montage of Duncan graduating, Duncan being called to Gray's Inn, Duncan taking silk, etc. That will have to be for another time. My contact with Singapore, as some of you will know, goes back many years before any professional involvement. My mother and stepfather lived there for many years very happily in an apartment in the Claymore, and thereafter in a serviced apartment in the Goodwood Park. and I was therefore already very familiar with the pleasures of visiting Singapore before conducting my first case in the jurisdiction. Indeed, my first experience of a very warm Christmas day was at the pool in the Claymore, though the memory is slightly tinged by the food poisoning I picked up that morning at the Goodwood Park, not, I hasten to add, something that would happen today, I'm sure. It is said that there are 7 ages of man, though perhaps 3 for the bar, as represented by the 3 figurines I have long treasured and which I share with you today. Although it is not easy with the virtual background, I shall do my best. The first, tall, eager, upright junior with a bright, shiny wig. The second, the polished junior silk, older, better informed, even if not wiser, impressive, but not always so upright of stance. And finally, the third, the old silk, bent and bowed, shrunken but still packing a hefty punch, battle-hardened but resilient, and resilience, as I hope you will see from my talk today, is a key component for success in our profession. However, in reality, and hence the words perpetual motion in my title for this talk, the 3 figurines might represent the big picture gradations of life at the bar, but the more granular analysis contains many more stages than that, as I will seek to show. And it is this which is one of the pleasures of our profession. In 35 years, I have worked from 4 different rooms, the 4th of which for the last 23 years, and if I did not have this false background and even more inappropriate apparent halo, you would realize the room is in serious need of a makeover. And yet throughout that period of 35 years, my life and career have been constantly changing. But let us now go back in time to begin at the beginning. It was my childhood dream to become a barrister. I would escape from school to the local library, now a fantastic Indian restaurant called the Cinnamon Club, and there I would sit in the library reading the novels of Henry Cecil about life at the bar in the decades before my school days began. I also was riveted by the memorable film of his first novel, Brothers-in-Law, a wonderful cast including Richard Attenborough, Ian Carmichael, Terry Thomas, Nicholas Parsons, John Le Mesurier, Leslie Phillips. The list goes on, as did the laughs at the hapless, bumbling junior barrister making his way in the world. I was entranced. There can be little better by way of preparation for the pitfalls of practice, and as you will gather as we go along, preparation for the pitfalls are much needed for all of us. I also occasionally watched Crown Court on TV, a wonderful series of gripping courtroom melodrama in the 1970s, which used actors and scripts for all the courtroom roles except that of the jury, which was made up of eligible jurors from the electoral roll. A fascinating insight which had me spellbound, though, as I shall explain, the pull of the criminal trial ultimately left me. I did contemplate other careers along the way. I think motorbike policeman figured prominently at one stage, mainly because of my obsession with motorbikes before I was old enough to risk my life on one. But happily, as it turned out, I kept coming back to the bar. My talk is entitled A Rewarding Life of a Career at the Bar, and of course that includes financially. No one could sensibly say that practice in international commercial litigation and arbitration is not financially rewarding. But I chose that title because I shall hope to demonstrate it is also rewarding in so many other ways also. The colleagues and the camaraderie of professional friends, the lifestyle of one's working life, the pleasure of working in a profession where so many impressive senior figures give so much of their time and commitment to future generations of practitioners and the life of the profession as they have enjoyed historically themselves. Overseas travel in quantities which has always made it a treat rather than a chore, and much more besides. Despite my enthusiasm for the prospect of a career at the bar, I did not read law at university. One of the things our American cousins, I think, may have got right, not reading law as an undergraduate study. I had the pleasure of studying history from the fall of the Roman Empire to the death of Churchill, with many fascinating interludes along the way. It has given me a lifetime hobby and much interest. I continue to this day as a member of the Oxford University External Advisory Panel to the History Faculty. There are many very successful barristers who did not read law. Jonathan Sumption, who similarly read history, indeed at the same college as I did, though somewhat before me, has waxed lyrical on the advantages of a first degree other than law. I have never really felt my clients have been disadvantaged by my having not read law as a first degree. Indeed, in significant respects, I think it is a bonus. There is more of a tendency when one studies all the core subjects together to see law as a tool by which to resolve a dispute rather than an academic pursuit in itself, although for many it of course is, and to see how remedies from different areas of the law interlock to provide a solution by which to resolve a dispute. In other words, a less compartmentalized view of the law. The key thing is the instinct or ability to recognize when it is likely that something is going to have been definitively resolved by binding authority. But for the most part, the tendency is to quote too many authorities rather than too few, and to forget that the resolution of most of our disputes really turns on the facts. It is very rare that you really lose a case which has the merits, but there is a binding legal authority against you. Why then the bar? For all the youthful and somewhat romanticized picture of practice at the bar, I did have what I thought were fairly substantial reasons also to justify the path I was to take. Independence of practice, your own practice from the outset. I liked the idea that I could choose to go to a gallery or a movie on a Wednesday afternoon and work on Saturday morning to make up for it, though in practice I have tended to end up working both on Wednesday afternoon and Saturday morning. It is, however, undoubtedly the case that there is a disproportionate number of barristers present at children's sports days, school plays, and so on. You do have a choice, just if you make time for these important things. There is no need most of the time for internal corporate politics, because those around you in chambers have little, if any, significant control over the development of your own practice. And perhaps because my father, reflecting sagely on my personality, opined that I had better go to the bar because I was ill-suited to partnership, which was probably true. Coming through university in the early 80s, many of my contemporaries were as fascinated as I was by the implications in the financial sector of Big Bang and the opportunities which that threw up. Indeed, I explained to my father that I was going to become a banker. He was unimpressed. Get your qualification as a lawyer first, he said. You can always become a banker after. But I never did, and I have no regrets on that score. Why international commercial law? Well, admittedly, a lifetime of penury at the criminal bar did not beckon, though it was a lot better paid when I started in practice. It undoubtedly offered for me the perfect combination of a decent quantity of advocacy with serious academic study, since the clients were willing and able to fund proper preparation of their cases. The reality also was that the tension of the criminal case and the gritty reality of family law were simply not for me. Marshalling for charming Philip Otten and Elizabeth Butler Sloss amply demonstrated this. I sat in on a criminal hearing. It was an awful case. A dentist who'd been convicted of raping his patients whilst they were sedated in the dentist's chair had gone to prison for that crime. Whilst in Ford Open Prison, he had been approached by a News of the World journalist posing as a hitman. It represented the worst excesses of checkbook journalism. This odious person explained that the dentist's wife had taken up with someone else and encouraged the dentist to think he would help have this interloper bumped off. Headlines such as "Dirty Dentist Plots Death of Wife's Secret Lover." The dentist had by this stage clearly lost the plot completely. He was from a humble background, and all the sacrifices his parents had made to enable him to advance himself had gone to waste. The tension as he awaited the verdict was awful. The scream from the dock as the dentist who was found guilty of plotting the death of his wife and her lover shouted, "By the 7 heavens, you have returned a false verdict," lives with me still in my memories. Family law was similarly a gruesome experience, with an awful child custody case on a divorce hearing, a rather odious about-to-be ex-husband revealing all the secret fantasies his ex-about-to-be wife had shared with him in the intimacy of their marriage, now trying to turn them against her as the basis for trying to prevent her having caring responsibilities for her children. The memory of both lives with me still, so how badly I would have fared on a lifetime of such a diet. No, it was international commercial law for me. The leading cases in contract disputes at all levels of the courts when I started were mostly being argued for one side or the other, or both, by barristers from 3 Essex Court, as my chambers were then known, by reference to their address, So I took myself there. I had a 5-week mini pupilage, in the course of which grateful clients were kind enough to give not only their proper council team, but also me, the hanger-on mini pupil, their smart corporate tie and a half bottle of whiskey. And this firmly reinforced my view that I was set on the right path. Pupilage interviews. My only interview was with the charming and frighteningly intelligent Nicholas, or Nick Lee Jones, learned author of MacGillivray on insurance law, amongst many other academic accolades. He simply said to me that one Tim Young, Queen's Counsel, had indicated, or not then Queen's Counsel, had indicated he would be very happy to be my main pupil master, as they were then called. And so that was it, really. I was also, of course, interviewed by the then senior clerk, Joss Byrne, to ensure that he could sell me. As was traditional in those days, his father had been senior clerk before him, and he was known as 10% Burns because of the percentage of his barrister's incomes, which he paid himself by way of remuneration. And so my pupil masters were set, 6 months with Tim Young, and then the balance, like going to finishing school, with the erudite Nick. I say the balance because I had spent some time working for a law firm and was therefore exempt from 3 months of my practicing pupilage. Working for a law firm was an invaluable experience, reducing the artificiality which can come with the limited exposure of young barristers to the real world, especially that inhabited by clients. I find it a great advantage and would highly recommend the experience to students, even if they have a choice as to whether to languish for a while as a paralegal. And on to pupilage, the first stage of the 7 stages of man, perhaps. Facing the wall, sitting in a room known as the arcade, because you progressed through it to get to the room beyond, which contained another 2 barristers. It was common for barristers to share rooms then. I sat sandwiched between Tim Young and a young Nick Hamblin, now a Supreme Court judge. Frighteningly efficient even then, he never took work home out of hours. It was astonishing how he managed to maintain his practice in this way. And the intellectual jousting went on much of the day behind my back between Nick and Tim, whilst I quietly absorbed it all. My first opinion was an interesting piece of work. I had not actually read the contract that I opined about, mainly because the contract, as was also common in shipping cases, was barely legible. My pupil master was very impressed with my work until he realized I had not read the contract and that my opinion was therefore perhaps more creative than would pass muster with clients or with the court. Despite the relative ease with which I secured pupilage, I applied only to 2 sets. The other also offered me pupilage, and I chose 3 Essex. We knew that obtaining the tenancy at the end of pupilage was in those days the real challenge. The year before me, there had been 4 pupils, none had been taken on. Hence, we lived in a perpetual state of fear of completing pupilage and then being thrust out into a world with no ports of refuge. There was a period of joy. During the course of pupilage, we were not welcome at Chambers tea. This was supposedly to give members of Chambers a chance to gossip about the pupils, although we suspected that it was really to give them a break from us. As I recall, perhaps wrongly, during my pupilage, the rules were changed to allow us to attend tea on Fridays. We dreaded Fridays when that was introduced. In any event, my pupil master was a determined attender of Chambers tea, and daily my life revolved around surviving until 4:30 p.m, when my pupil master routinely left for tea, and I raced off to the coffee shop with my fellow pupils to steal a quick cup of tea or coffee before rushing back in the hope that our absence hadn't been noticed. On this occasion in mid-November, Tim had lost a case before Mr. Justice Andrew Leggett and was convinced this was due to a certain antipathy which he feared existed between the 2 of them. His client could not afford to appeal, so Tim, proud possessor of a first-generation green screen Amstrad with no automatic backing up computer, spent all day bashing away at his keyboard, pro bono, crafting the appeal papers. Tea time came and went. My eyelids were drooping, and Tim showed no signs of pausing to go to tea. Off the room was a cupboard with a basin and a kettle, and beyond that another cupboard with a loo in it. I took myself into the cupboard, closed the door behind me with the light on, and proceeded to prepare a cup of tea for myself. I filled the kettle, plugged it in, and boom, all the lights went out. All I could hear from next door was a roared expletive, stomp, 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 door opening and slamming shut, and then all was quiet and dark in my cupboard. I lingered in my cupboard, contemplating alternative careers. Eventually, the lights came back on. I emerged from my cupboard, wondering whether I should just leave Chambers immediately and not return. I decided to tough it out. Tim returned with great kindness, apologizing on the basis that he knew the kettle was faulty and should have warned me. I breathed a huge sigh of relief, whilst profusely apologizing myself also. I survived pupilage, and alone of the 4 pupils in my year, I was offered tenancy. The feeling of elation at being offered tenancy was so euphoric, as I recall, that I walked all the way home across West London, unable to contemplate being confined to the underground. I walked with such a skip in my step that I would have hit my head in the tunnels if I'd tried. During my year of pupilage, I had on the side been part of a rather serious rowing crew, which had experienced some degree of success. I had not told anyone in Chambers, because I thought they would not take me very seriously as an aspiring barrister if they knew I was spending a lot of my limited spare time messing about in a boat. In particular, I had not taken more than a few days' holiday, and specifically, I had not asked for time off to row at Henley. Fortunately, the decision on tenancy was made just in time, and after accepting my offer of tenancy, I rapidly explained that I would need to take a couple of weeks off straight away to prepare for and row at Henley. Needless to say, once I had broached the subject, the members of Chambers were fully supportive and in equal measure shocked that I had not previously broached the subject. The power of irrational fear when we are trying to make our way in the world. Finally, my practice began. I was the 21st member of Chambers, and my name appeared on the board which stood outside Chambers. My life as a practicing barrister had begun, and I contemplated it would be one of triumph after triumph. Of course, it did not quite turn out like that, at least in the early days. Starting out in practice, I chose perpetual motion because I shall seek to show that although technically the bar is only divided between juniors and silks, in practice, the evolution of your career, your practice, your reputation is altogether different. It tends to fall into 5 or 6 year chunks. The first 5 years is all about getting instructed at all. A lot of that comes not, of course, from your own reputation, because you don't have one yet, but from the Chambers which has given you tenancy. In our line of work, the early days will often be paperwork, and clients will be testing you out. Affordability will not be an issue, and nor will availability. They will be testing for ability, although in significant measure that will be assumed in your favor to start with. And above all, in many respects, they will be testing for affability. They were not always wise on the part of my clients in assuming ability. My first arbitration took place at the Baltic before the wonderful Bob Reed. He was a marvelous arbitrator of the old school. The clients on both sides and the lawyer on the other, barrister on the other side, was practiced and experienced. For me, it was my first outing. I had a brand new pilot case, which I was absolutely delighted and obviously very proud. And in it, I had brought all the relevant things that I needed in order to present my client's case to the best of my abilities. I arrived at the Baltic. I began to set up at my desk in the Baltic. I put the pilot case on top of the desk. I checked the combination lock, which I was confident was the way in which I was going to get into my case, and I was totally and utterly unable to open my pilot case. The client, again showing the sort of kindness which I have received again and again throughout my career at the bar, put an avuncular arm around me, took me off to a cupboard. Not all of my stories are about cupboards. And in the Baltic, we found a jemmy. He took the jemmy. He opened my pilot case. My pilot case still bears the scars of battle, but we did get into the pilot case, and we did successfully win the case. My first commercial court case was in front of the aforesaid Mr. Justice Andrew Leggett. It was going extremely badly. My client had a fantastic case, and it was very clear that my client should win on the basis of the case itself. The claimant had sued the wrong person. They sued the individual. He was a wonderful second-hand ship scrapping dealer. And unusually in that industry, he conducted all his business through the one ship company, which was the only company that he had. He just only scrapped one ship at a time, always using the same company. Deeply suspicious, the claimant had assumed that the one ship company would simply be a brief conduit for assets and that there was no point suing the corporate entity, and they had become obsessed with suing the individual in whose name the contract had initially been entered until at a later stage, by agreement, it had been agreed that the company would be nominated as the party. Now, there was a solution to the case, I suspect, that basically in order for the new company to become liable under the contract, it didn't necessarily mean that my client ceased to be liable under the contract, but that was not a point which my opponent took. And I think Mr. Justice Andrew Leggett was very conscious of the fact that there was a point to defeat my client, but he couldn't quite work out what it was. Anyway, the morning went on and my client was being cross-examined, Andrew Leggett getting increasingly angry with the client. My own attempts at cross-examination had been repeatedly met with hostility and anger, including, "Mr. Matthews, this case will move at the speed of my pen, not yours," and many other, as I attempted in my own early days and my own limited ways to try to manage the case, never having done it before. Ultimately, we approached lunchtime and I was about to have my witness released so that I could discuss the case with him over lunch at the end of his examination, cross-examination. And just as we were getting to the point when he would be released, and I was about to say, "May my client now be released," Mr. Justice Andrew Leggett turned furiously to my client in the witness box and said, "If the claimant had sued your company, would you have put the company in funds to meet the claim?" My client very politely said, "Yes, of course I would." So at that point, Mr. Justice Leggett got up, screamed at my client, "Why didn't you just pay then?" and stormed out of the court. So no discussion with my client over lunch. I stood there thinking, is this really what I've joined up for? Is this really what I wanted to be here for? Is this really why I wanted to come to the bar? And did I really want to spend the rest of my career dealing with awful, awful judges and interventions and difficulties on a daily basis like this? And I was just about to say to myself, right, that's it, I'm leaving, when a marvelous chap, John Dickinson, who was my instructing solicitor at Constance, turned to me and said, "Oh, Duncan, thank goodness it's you standing up there doing this. I would hate to have to do that." And it appealed to all my regrettably vanity, my regrettable vanity, and my false vanity as well. And I smiled and preened and said, "Oh, well, yes, of course, that's what we do," and so on and so forth. And without any further thought, I carried on with my career at the bar. There is a tendency in your early days to think senior lawyers were born fully fledged advocates. It's not so. One of the best senior advocates in my chambers, who became an outstanding silk and then senior judge and arbitrator, tells a lovely story of how he appeared in front of the legendary master, acting for his clients, a fearless young advocate cutting his teeth in the master's corridor. He had made what he thought was a tolerably good, if not outstanding, fist of developing his client's case to the master, when he was interrupted with the memorable words, "Mr. let's call him Smith, I'm going to adjourn this case to give your client an opportunity to instruct counsel so that his case can be properly put before me." These are heart-stopping, if not career-stopping moments, as you return to chambers in a state of advanced depression. It was not just the advocacy experiences that could lead to meltdowns. I was instructed early in my career to draft a preliminary act, which, to those of you unfamiliar as I was with the intricacies of collision cases, is the sealed answers to a series of questions which the captain of each ship which has been involved in a collision answers as to what course and speed they were doing, what they thought the other vessel had been doing at the time of collision, what lights had been showing, what changes of course, and so on and so forth. And for the two versions to match up, they usually involved one ship having to turn 180 degrees and turn turtle and pursue the other at about 50 knots. But there we are. These were then sealed and opened up at the hearing. The general principle was that they could not be amended. These instructions came into me, and I was busy, and weeks went past, and I had not had the chance to turn to the papers. Finally, late one evening, I opened the papers and then reached for the white book to find out what all this stuff about a preliminary act was all about. My eyes lighted on two very clear passages in the white book on the subject of preliminary acts. First, the deadline for service was, I think, 6 weeks from service of points of claim, a period of time which in my particular case had long since passed. The papers had been waiting for me to turn to them even for longer than that. Second, the clear statement in the white book that it was not the practice of the court to grant extensions of time for the drafting of this particular document. My mind, of course, was immediately a turmoil of horrors. Here I was, in my early years of practice, facing my first negligence claim for failing to settle a preliminary act before expiry of the immutable time limit. I had a terrible night, my mind racked with anxiety, the end of my career beckoning after such a short period of practice. The next morning, I picked up the phone to my solicitor, full of contrition and ready to face the music. The experienced Admiralty solicitor barely gave me a moment's notice. "Oh, don't worry about that," he said. "I agreed a 3 months extension with the other side a few weeks ago. Let me know if it's not long enough, and I'll agree another extension." Another opening of my mind was the Liverpool shipping course called the Sharp End, run by Brooks Bell. The course had been set up by Brooks Bell because as experts, they had become weary of the practical ignorance of the barristers, berating them or factual witnesses for things which were simply physical impossibilities, utterly due to ignorance. It was a very valuable practical training. We wandered around a number of ships, getting a feel for the sheer scale of these huge vessels, with which many of us, of course, had no real experience at all. I managed repeatedly to crash the Dover-Calais ferry into all sorts of other mobile and fixed structures. I hasten to add that this was on a simulator, and I gained the most profound respect for how the ferry captains managed safely to navigate their craft across some of the busiest shipping lanes at all, never mind within periods of time which would be required to make the service financially viable. I did thereafter, however, manage to avoid some of the worst howlers in cross-examination of factual and expert witnesses in shipping cases. I again developed friendships with other lawyer colleagues on the course, which I value to this day. As a junior, it is not all woes. I remember one case that I had, the John Frederickson case. I was one of many counsel, but I was the only junior representing a party. What we then called the plaintiffs were represented by Gordon Pollock, Queen's Counsel. The other defendants had all been separated into different teams to give a semblance of separateness and independence to what were in practice simply arms of John Frederickson's empire. It was an Order 11, Order 12, Rule 8 challenge. The various defendants were all arguing various aspects of forum non-convenience. Pollock was on rumbustious form. When he identified that the judge, Mr. Justice Evans, as he then was, had a somewhat thin grasp of his client's lead affidavit by which the ex parte leave to serve out had originally been granted, he excoriated the judge on the basis that in that case, the exchanges between the defendants and the judge were simply the blind leading the blind. The other defendants had all made an impressive showing of themselves, as you would expect, from the array of barrister luminaries like Ken Rokerson and Neville Thomas, and many others who'd been wheeled out to act for the various other defendants. My poor benighted defendants were 3 of the former directors of Frederickson companies who had been imprisoned in Norway for their sins. My only case, really, was that it was terribly inconvenient for my clients to have proceedings against them in London because they were incarcerated in Norway. Pollock could have been as beastly to me as he was to the judge and to the other big beasts, but he was not. He went out of his way to be kindness itself to me. A very valuable lesson I learned. It is never necessary to take advantage of the inexperience of others. Pick on someone your own size, even if in the case of Pollock, you could find anyone matching that description. Being led was an invaluable part of the experience of this and my entire period of junior life. There is no blueprint or one size fits all for success at the bar. Successful barristers come literally and metaphorically in all shapes and sizes. Study how leaders and opponents do it. Keep learning, picking the good bits which you might be able to adopt to yourself and adapt, discarding what works for others but not for you, and trying to avoid what you don't think works at all. I learned invaluable lessons from the outstanding leaders with whom I was lucky enough to work. They were as varied as you could contemplate, each amazing in their own very different way. And so on to the middle junior years, the next 5 years. You've had your first advocacy experience, and crucially, you're trying to build a repeat business, the clients who will stick with you for years. They like what you have done for their clients once, or maybe twice already, and they have the confidence to stick with you as your hourly rate starts to grow. You have to face difficult decisions about the nature of practice you want to develop, more lead work or more of your own, bigger cases, which could be all consuming for years, or more smaller cases. Experiencing that sign of confidence when you get repeat instructions, let alone your own cases get bigger, is a fantastic buzz. I was instructed in these years on one wonderful case, which involved our entire team going to India, to Delhi, to argue an ICC arbitration case. I had a wonderful Geordie instructing solicitor who had a deep suspicion of those around him, all of whom were trying to carry his briefcase for him. He was repeatedly snatching his cases away from people he assumed were trying to rob him. This all transformed around day 5, when he will realize that they were all there to help him. And from that day onwards, he would appear in the lobby of the hotel in the morning, just in the suit that he was wearing, all other baggage and paraphernalia being carried by a whole train of people running behind him. I had an amazing Indian junior. His main role was to guide me in the arcane ways of the then Indian law of evidence, which, for example, had not then adopted a hearsay act. Everything had to be proved. My opponent was a former Solicitor General of India. He thought that the whole thing would run a few days and then adjourn for 6 months, as was generally the custom in arbitration in India. He had not bargained for our excellent arbitrator, Cecil Abraham, then of Sherm Delamore in Malaysia, who was determined that the case was going to complete in one sitting, and Cecil was then going to return to Malaysia. There was an increasing string of lawyers from other cases coming into the offices where the arbitration was being held, interrupting my opponent's cross-examination of the various fact and expert witnesses in order to get his instructions on the other cases he'd been expecting to be able to move on to, but found himself mired in this arbitration which was running the distance, much to the fury of our arbitrator at these constant interruptions and my own amusement. The arbitrator tried to elongate the sitting days in order to accommodate for these interruptions, but he could not. The reason was very simple. There was no electricity for those who opened the offices to have hot water to wash with because of power restrictions operating in the city, and in consequence, it was simply impossible for them to get in earlier to open the offices earlier. As the case continued, my opponent had to concede point of evidence after point of evidence in exchange for our giving him some time to prepare cross-examination of the fact, let alone expert witnesses that he had not at all expected he would be having to deal with at this sitting. I also dropped into the Supreme Court in Delhi to watch the courts in action, and the whole episode was a lovely reminder of my early days reading those Henry Cecil novels about how the silks then conducted themselves, dropping in to do an opening here, a cross-examination there, a reply in another court, with batteries of juniors standing by to update the silk on progress being made in the other cases. And of course, my junior admirably performed his other main function, which was to ensure for his benefit and mine that I did not get any food poisoning in India, which I did not. I had the most wonderful Indian food that I've ever eaten in my life. Indeed, it's one of the joys of our area of practice that the international dimension extends not just to the clients and the subject matter of the cases, but also to the location of where we're called upon to argue them. When I started at the bar, English QCs had a thriving global practice, appearing in courts the world over, with residual or relatively easy call to the local bar to obtain advocacy rights. Progressively, that was closed off by jurisdictions eager to develop their domestic talent. Happily for the international family of lawyers, despite expectations, that did not close the door to opportunities for appearances overseas. Over the period of my practice, the global international arbitration community has mushroomed along with the caseload. There are now plentiful opportunities for lawyers to be truly international in the jurisdictional reach of their practices, and unlike before, the opportunities are now there even well before taking silk. And so on to more senior junior and the next 5 years. You're an established advocate. You have a huge practice with repeat clients. You begin to have taking silk in your sights and building up to that enormous application. The pressure of work is huge, but there are good solutions. Firstly, bring on juniors, bring others into the work. Don't hog it all for yourself. And don't hang on to the type of work which you should be sending down to those coming up behind you. There are some who permanently, as they go through their practice, seek to hang on to every possible case that they can. You need to allow your practice to develop and that of others to develop around you without fearing that they are somehow threatening you if they're taking on cases that 5 years earlier you would have done. If you're still doing the cases that you would have done 5 years earlier, you're stalling, not growing. And increasingly, that brings with it an ability to deal with the unexpected. I was acting for a German-American multinational against what was effectively known as the Bulgarian mafia in an English arbitration. There was a group of Bulgarian secret servicemen who, when the wall came down, were the only people who knew where all the Secret Service money was hidden in the various different bank accounts. And so very simply, when the wall came down and suddenly Bulgaria became a capitalist system, they swiped the money from the Swiss bank accounts and set themselves up in business. They set up a respectable arm in Switzerland with a former Cazenove banker as chairman. As the arbitration wore on, it became increasingly apparent that the chairman was being kept on, indeed probably being kept alive, only as long as he was useful to them on this case. The more I cross-examined him, the more miserable it became, until one day at lunchtime in the arbitration, he simply got drunk and came back in the afternoon to be further cross-examined, very much the worse for wear. It was very much a surreal experience for me, as he was by now completely discredited, but I had to complete the process in any event. And then the somnolent arbitrators, the worst case scenario being when a sole arbitrator falls asleep. Then indeed it becomes very difficult and can be very challenging if the usual tricks of dropping the files and nudging them and taking any other means you can to draw attention all fail. I had that once, funnily enough, against again Nick Hamblin, and we managed to stumble our way through, but it was not a particularly high moment. It's the sort of thing that one has to get used to dealing with as part of the daily activities and then trying to explain it to one's clients. A junior silk. The first thing you notice on taking silk is that you're back at the bottom of the pile. The joy and relief at making the transition from junior to silk is tempered by the realization that the juicy senior junior cases no longer come your way, because in the thinking of the client, this case does not really merit a silk. It is replaced by the cases where the client thinks, this is a dog of a case, but maybe a little QC fairy dust will transform the sow's ear into a silk purse. Again, though, there are the upsides. With the international practice, new doors open again. Work in the Caribbean jurisdictions is a particular joy that still is available. Russian cases started in the late 1990s, and then came the Chinese cases hot on their heels. Why the Caribbean? Well, because, of course, mostly with international commercial disputes, there are 3 guides to jurisdiction. You follow the jurisdiction clauses in the contract, for sure, but you also often have to go where the corporation or high net worth individual is to be found, and ultimately, you usually have to go where the money is, and that is very often in an offshore center. These are very special experiences. They're way out of your comfort zone. You often do not even know if you're supposed to stand up or sit down to make your submissions, and every court in every island differs. You walk through the hotel lobby in 18th century clothes. I still derive a wicked amusement when you pass someone in their swimmers and you see that fleeting look in their eyes as they realize they are in their swimmers and you are in court dress. And just for a fleeting moment, that look of fear goes through their eyes as they are worried that they're having one of those nightmares. And it is actually they in their swimmers who are hopelessly underdressed before they realize, of course, that it is you that is the wrong one. I've had all sorts of experiences. The BVI court, before it acquired its modern purpose-built commercial court, was the old Parliament chamber that we used to use, and the fans would whirl around above us, and the doors would all be open to the outside. And just as you were getting to your very finest submission, which you thought was really going to bring the judge with you, you would find that out in the streets outside, either you would have the competition of a cock crowing or a cow mooing to demonstrate the banality of your submission, which you had thought was such a winner. I never have my suitcase ready at the back of the court for a swift getaway, although many do. I always allow a little extra time on island, and in the worst case scenario, you might find you have a bit of time spare, and in the worst case, as I say, you can always have a sail around the islands. What is the point of going all that way, just to go from the airport to the court and back to the airport? And then you're an established silk. The next 5 years, you've managed to climb off the bottom rung of silk and persuaded a wider group of clients that you have what it takes. And at last, you might think, time to relax and enjoy the experience of success. Of course, it's no such thing. I've always been convinced that the moment you sit back and enjoy it is the moment when it's time to stop. But happily, that has not happened to me yet. Instead, you realize that simply doing what you do well is not enough. It is not what people are paying you for at this level. They're paying you to do something better or different, some extra pizzazz. And so the pressure to perform stays high. It was Marshall Hall, I think, who was routinely physically sick with the anxiety of performance well into his height of success as a silk. And then senior silk. The next 5 years, the stakes in your cases get higher still. The expectations keep rising. No matter how good you are, unless you're Sidney Kentridge, there will always be someone better than you. So there is always scope to improve. You begin to sit more as a tribunal, whether as an arbitrator or part-time judge, and that again helps you to raise your game. You deliberate with senior colleagues and learn more about what is more and what is less effective in persuading other people. You experience more senior colleagues at the top of their game, trying to persuade you of the justice of their case. It is an outstanding learning experience having this benefit, which enables you to continue honing and improving your own skills. There are also game changers if you've never done it all. You have never done it all, rather. Who would have thought 2.5 years ago of the radical changes that would occur so quickly in how we now conduct litigation? Working almost exclusively with electronic bundles, cross-examining remotely, making submissions remotely, hybrid hearings where you're having to both secure the attention of the immediate audience present physically, but also people attending remotely on video. All of these developments, and there have been many more, of course, over this period, call upon us to be willing and able to change how we do things, to change the way we've done things for many years, to evolve methods of practice, and in some cases completely cast old ones aside and develop entirely new ones. So where now? The international commercial sector of the legal profession has thrived through COVID. Chambers, law firms have never been busier, but it has come with an isolation, which we must work hard to break down again. There are many positives to emerge from the radical change to how we've delivered dispute resolution services over the last 2 years. Gone, I hope, forever is that excruciating embarrassment when someone has been flown across 2 continents to give evidence, only in effect to be asked their name, rank, and serial number, and to confirm their evidence, asked a few short questions in cross-examination almost out of politeness, and then released with all the attendant waste of time, expense, and resources. The ease of maintaining links, superficially at least, with overseas friends and colleagues is hugely expanded. The sheer numbers signed up to this talk today from a huge range of jurisdictions being a case in point. But there are serious issues. Our lawyers at all levels are working harder than ever. We are deluged with a daily avalanche of emails with which it is impossible to keep up. I was once cross-examining a broker and demanded to know why, if he disagreed with the contents of an email, he'd not corrected it. He responded that it had come in whilst he was on holiday. No excuse, I went on. Why had he not responded on his return from holiday? Well, he replied witheringly, when he got back from holiday, he had 6,000 unread emails in his inbox and he just deleted the lot. Of course, I went on to a great victory, though my memory eludes me as to how, but I remember thinking at the time, what a good answer, and I wish I could take that approach. It has been said that if you spend all day answering your emails, you're not doing your job, unless your job is to answer your emails, which is not most people's job descriptions. When I started in practice, if a client wanted to speak to a QC on the phone about his case, you would book in a call days in advance. The norm sitting in chambers was to have 1 or 2 phone calls at most a day. The luxury of being able to give one's entire focus for an entire day to the one case open on your desk was an exceptional privilege, but it also meant exceptionally high levels of attention and therefore work. No longer. We do not have holidays or downtime. We are always accessible. Again, when I started in practice, if I went abroad or overseas, it was just acknowledged that I could not realistically deal with matters. I had no papers, no books. Now there is no such barrier. There is no practical obstacle to our being at the beck and call at all times. The level of focus at Zoom meetings is not the same. We know that often enough, others are keeping up with their emails, getting on with other work, etc. The default is increasingly becoming remote attendance because that is easier. But what about the quality of the process? These are some of the burdens of the technological age. There are, of course, many bonuses. For clients, there may indeed be huge benefits, particularly on cost. Machines are beginning to cost less than lawyers. They work 24/7 and are beginning to do a wide range of tasks more quickly and efficiently and about as reliably. But AI also represents a very real threat to the profession and therefore to the public. Before the pandemic, I was privileged to chair a meeting of young SIAC in person in Maxwell Chambers. Not entirely tongue-in-cheek, our analysis of the progress and future of AI in the legal industry led us to the conclusion that before long, the determination of disputes would be more efficiently and reliably decided by machines than by human judges and arbitrators. Senior lawyers would continue to have an edge through their added value of knowledge, experience, and judgment. Junior lawyers, however, could be substantially replaced by the advance of technology. The flaw, you will have spotted, is that without a healthy input of junior lawyers, where are the senior lawyers of the future to come from? The main challenge, as it seems to me, for the future of the legal profession is how to harness the benefits of technology for the good of the dispute resolution industry and the service that it provides to the public, whilst at the same time ensuring that it does not overwhelm or undermine the very thing which lies at its heart, its people, all of you. And what of the future for me? The perpetual motion will continue, I hope, for years to come. We have already established that the value added of the senior lawyer cannot, at least so far, be replaced by technology. And so I remain optimistic of continuing to have a prominent role to play internationally in what is now our global legal system. I could not claim that I live to work, but I have been privileged to be permitted to enjoy the way I earn my living. And I continue with the same buzz as I have always enjoyed from the role of advocate and legal advisor in disputes around the world. During the second lockdown, I found myself marooned on an island in the Indian Ocean from late December 2020 to the end of February 2021. The hotel I was staying at gave me my own villa for hearings and consultations. I found myself doing a case in the morning in Singapore and in the evening in the Turks and Caicos. What a brave new world, I thought, to be able to span the world in this way. And then, of course, reality impinged, and I realized I was paying to be at the hotel, whereas in the ordinary pre-pandemic world, I would have had one trip to Singapore for one case and then another trip to the Turks and Caicos Islands for another. And I realized that maybe I should be rethinking how I wanted to take my practice forwards. Maybe the ability to span the world without moving around in it had significant downsides as well as upsides. I have recently, as of the beginning of this week, stepped down as head of Chambers. 8 years is a long time in the job these days, and a forward-looking Chambers such as 20 Essex is as mindful of modern concepts of corporate governance as it should be. It gives me an opportunity to focus more on my own practice, which I shall undoubtedly be doing. It also gives me greater scope to continue the work I have always done to support the profession. For many years, I was a member of and then chair of the Education and Training Committee of the Bar Council. I had several years sitting on a panel with David Neuberger to enhance socioeconomic diversity of entry to the profession, and then chairing the implementation panel to bring the recommendations into effect, which has been very successful. I'm a bencher of Gray's Inn and now Master of Education at the Inn. I've had many years on the Inn's Management Committee and as a trustee of the Council of the Inns of Court, which seeks to coordinate the work of the Inns in such important areas as training and discipline in the profession. It is a source of endless surprise to those outside our profession how much time and effort our members dedicate to the profession and to those coming after. the resumption of foreign travel and overseas visits for hearings, and to catch up with colleagues and many friends made in the course of my career so far is also a great pleasure that awaits. I still have the hunger for the council work. Little beats the thrill of the well-crafted and effective cross-examination. We all enjoy the adrenaline from the battle and the sweet scent of victory, and there is even consolation in simply taking part. David McIntosh, the former senior partner of Davies Arnold Cooper and president of the England and Wales Law Society, once confided in me that there was only one thing worse than losing a big case, and that was not being in it. The total absorption that comes with engagement with your tribunal as you try to persuade them of the merits of your client's case, the notes that get left to one side, and the preparation means you have it all in your head, even though you do not realize it is there. Like that moment you start writing in an exam, and you realize that after all, it is all there. Well, Misong, and now, as with the exam, the time comes to stop and put down my metaphorical pen. Thank you for allowing me to share my experiences of practice, and I hope that some bits of it will have been of interest and perhaps have resonated with many of you, perhaps even provided some encouragement. To those of you who have been listening, if you have been, I thank you, and I'm very happy to take any questions that we may have.
Thank you, Duncan, for your sharings. We will now proceed with the Q&A segment. To all participants, if you have questions for Duncan, please use the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. I will be reading them out for him to answer. You may also request to speak by using the raise hand function. Well, Duncan, let me forward you the first question of our attendees. As you know, among the attendees today, there are many young, aspiring barristers from many different jurisdictions. How would you advise those internationals to distinguish themselves as a practicing barrister in the UK?
Well, I think that the starting position is to engage with other people and to recognize how enthusiastic the more senior practitioners are about giving advice. The assumption often is a fear that somehow as you're coming into the world, you don't really know anybody. Everybody seems to know everybody else. And you don't really seem to be able to engage at the conferences and the seminars that we have. And the short answer is that everybody is really enthusiastic about you succeeding, you coming in. They're very happy about sharing their advice. And the reality is that you do start with the early years of attending the seminars in person, which I hope we'll be seeing more of again. And as I said, it's one of the disadvantages of these webinars that you do lose out a little bit on the opportunity for personal contact between people. But if you can get to any of the physical seminars, participate, stand up. Very often people are nervous of saying something, and I understand that. We're all nervous of saying something. Very often, even when you hear the more senior and seasoned participants speaking, you can tell the tension and the stress in their voice, because they're having to concentrate very hard about what they're saying and what they're going to say. And it's often very discouraging because it all seems to come so easily for them. Well, the short answer is they've done it before, but they are very welcoming and encouraging to you. So I certainly think that is one of the approaches that one needs to adopt. One also through that process encounters people. As I said at the outset, there are many characteristics which will, and many of them begin with A, which will be taken for granted pretty much, at least the first time round, by those instructing you. But what you really need to win on these days, which was not so vital when I started, and that is the concept of affability. And this is something I've heard again and again from in-house counsel and from solicitors. That element of the A's is very important indeed. I still remember I did a beauty parade, increasingly common now, of course, as a junior, in a case where I was being led. To save his blushes, I won't tell you the identity of the silk. But the whole purpose of the beauty parade was that the Swiss bank that was instructing me wanted this particular silk to do the case and knew that this particular silk was a very difficult character to work with. And so I was beauty paraded simply over my experience of working with this silk, whether I thought we'd work well as a team and how it would come together. And of course, it did come together and we did work well as a team, but it just demonstrates how important that aspect is to the clients. And that is something, again, you can demonstrate by participation. Ultimately, though, What will bring the clients back for more and more is the way that you perform. We do a lot more marketing than we used to do, but the best marketing is still the last case you've done.
Exactly, as you mentioned earlier, resilience is one of the most important characteristic of a successful barrister. But you have mentioned so many good reasons why to be a barrister and why it is rewarding. But do you have any regrets? As in, are there any compelling reasons for not becoming a barrister at all?
Well, quite a few. If you don't like persuading and you don't like arguing a client's case, the bar is the wrong profession for you. If you want to be in an environment which doesn't particularly champion independence, but you want to be in a more protected environment of the workplace, where you have you start off as an employee and you develop through the protections that an employee has, then again, if you are slightly more risk averse, there's a lot to be said for that approach. It does take a certain character and a certain attitude of mind to succeed at the bar. There are long, lonely hours. There are many times when you wonder if it's all going to come tumbling around about you. And it's a very challenging experience. So if that is what excites you and makes you thrive, then that is excellent. But there are many people for whom that is a disaster area. It's very stressful for many people. If you don't thrive on that kind of stress, you need to avoid it altogether. So it is very much the job for the person who has the right attitudes, the right personality. And it is not for everybody. I fully accept that. It happens to chime very well with my personality and approach to life, but there are plenty who do extremely well in other parts of the dispute resolution system, which plays to their own talents. And that, again, is absolutely as it should be. And it's a rewarding part of the system that we now operate much more as a team, with the different components operating together, providing their own specialism and skill set, which is more valuable than the previous system, which operated when I started, which was very much barrister-led. It was didactic. It was handed down from the bar. There was a lovely story about the great Sidney Kentridge, who was one of the defense counsel in a big case. There were many defendants, and although he's no longer sadly alive, I'll spare him his blushes by not identifying who the lead silk was. But the lead silk had called a gathering of all the defense barristers in his room, and he sat down without huge knowledge of the case or of the intricacies of it, let alone that sort of knowledge and skill set that Sidney Kentridge had. But he opined and held forth for a long time. There, of course, weren't enough chairs for everybody. Sidney Kentridge had to sit on the floor at the back of the room and listen whilst this silk held forth on how they all ought to conduct themselves. And we got to the end of it, and the leader said, right, does anybody have any questions? And this lovely tone from Sidney Kentridge at the back of the room from the floor said, I wonder if we might possibly have some biscuits. And it was just the wonderful puncturing of the pomposity of the moment, and beautifully delivered.
Wonderful. I would like to address this question from one of our attendees. It is related to what you just said in your answers just now. As we are interested in how you manage to become one of the leading barristers in the world, we know that for us aspiring lawyers and all like young barristers, we want to have time off somehow. Like, I'm speaking about holidays. Hearing how you function in your day-to-day life, how do you even manage to give yourself holiday and time for family? Yeah, maybe you can share. Yeah.
I think this is one of the most difficult questions, and I think this is something we have to work out as a profession. Because I think that too many obstacles have now been put in the way of a decent work-life balance. I was very lucky because when I started, we didn't have believe it or not, mobile phones. And indeed, an entire means of communication has come and gone, in effect, in the time that I've been practicing, namely the fax machine. When I started, we had telexes, and we now, of course, have moved on to emails. And so the reality is that, as I indicated, there were periods when you were away. It was not necessarily at the weekends. And one of my very first cases as a junior, I was required to work through the night in order to produce a draft pleading. I got paid a sum of money, which I regarded was the riches of Croesus at the time for doing so. But the fact remains that that is something that happened, but it happened rarely. And you did have holidays. When I started, the running of time for doing things like submissions and so on, and putting in points of claim, particulars of claim and so on in the High Court, in the White Book, stopped for August and September. If it was the 27th of July and you had 14 days in which to do something, you had until the 10th of October. And it was an extraordinary freedom. And then little by little that went. September was abolished as a gap, as it were. And then it shifted to the 10th of September. And then August ultimately has gone as well. The attitude of many judges, many clients, many lawyers is too much troubled with machismo and with not wanting to appear to be weak, not wanting to appear to take time off. And I think this is very dangerous, and I don't think it's constructive, and I think it does damage the way that we work. And so we are going to have to face it. Firms are now doing it. They're beginning to say, particularly of their employees, that at certain times phones or emails have to be switched off. They're beginning to teach people not to send their emails from partners to junior solicitors at 3 o'clock in the morning just because they've had some brilliant idea, but only sending it at 3 o'clock in the morning if it actually has to be dealt with at 3 o'clock in the morning. Otherwise, send it the next morning. And we've got to become more disciplined to allow people to have that gap and to get something back into their lives. I did consciously say to myself, if I work 125% of how much another person works every year, I will do a quarter more cases than they do. I will have a quarter more profile than they do, and so on and so forth. And that undoubtedly helped me. I had a very, very busy practice as a senior junior. It propelled me into silk, and I kept going for many years as a silk because of that. And it was very hard work. But as I say, we had the breaks, and now people are not getting them. And we've got to, as an industry, find a way of allowing people to have their breaks, have their period off. Otherwise, it'll be all the classic scenarios of burnout and so on. But it's absolutely right.
Thank you for sharing with us this insightful advice and own opinion. As you know, the majority of our lectures today, the attendees are from Singapore. And one of the attendees would like to ask you, what are your personal thoughts of the level of advocacy in Singapore?
Well, I think it's extremely good. I mean, I've had the pleasure of hearing as advocates SCs like Kavinder Bull, who frankly are amongst the best in the world. And the reality is that some part of the advantage that perhaps English commercial barristers have is over the volume of cases that we have and the regularity with which one is doing the same sort of cases, which may be an advantage that the bar has in London, which is more diluted elsewhere. But the reality is that I have seen outstanding performers in Singapore. Singapore have first-rate advocates, and I very much enjoy working with them, as I would have been doing had my case not settled and had I not been in London instead of Singapore right now. And that would have been a great pleasure, working with Mayor Brown and against Rajan Tan, as I have before, and enjoyed very high-level cooperation and conflicts with them.
Thank you. Now I would like to ask you a more straightforward question. What do you prefer more, Duncan? Arbitration or litigation?
I think you should be able to do both. I love both. I enjoy both. I find arbitration obviously more convivial. And it's one of the regrets that I have about an increasing tendency to have virtual hearings, that you miss out on the opportunities to chat around the tea point, chat over lunch. When I started in practice, I mean, I mentioned the witness that I was cross-examining who had got drunk at lunchtime. That was possible not least because at the arbitration venues, bottles of wine were routinely left out on the tables at lunchtime. Progressively, participation in that diminished, but nevertheless, the conviviality and the community is a wonderful thing, and I enjoy it very much. And obviously, you get less of that, but the rigor of the courtroom, the majesty of it, the real sense of theatre that you have in the court, and I love the theatre, and the real sense of that you get in the court is something which I equally love. You do have to recognize that they are very different skill sets, but the underlying skill set is that of advocacy, and I believe that a good advocate should be able to do both. But I do think that they each have their merits, and I enjoy both of them very much, and like the fact that I have a practice which is broadly 50-50.
Wonderful to hear that. And you mentioned earlier in your talk that there are many ways nowadays for lawyers to be more international involved. And speaking of how you have started back then in your practice, your area of practice back then was in shipping, which was one of the prime areas. But this, however, has changed these days. And shipping is not anymore one of the most exciting areas to practice like it was in the 50s or to the 90s. So in your view, do you recommend to continue shipping litigation arbitration in the next 5 to 10 years for aspiring barristers?
Yes, I mean, I think the reality is that 30 years ago, shipping cases were the leading contract cases across the board. It was the exciting area of the law to be involved in. It was the cases that went up to the House of Lords and to all the major commercial jurisdictions, and that made it very exciting to be in. It involved fun, if you like that sort of thing, which I did. I love the romanticism of the shipping community and of ships and the idea of international trade and so on. I enjoy that very much, and that was great. There has been, I think, significantly an insurer-led drive down on fees, which has made it impossible for the same levels of support to be provided. And therefore, I think that the sort of civil fraud cases, the banking and finance, and increasingly we're going to find the fintech and the crypto fraud cases really being the fascinating and interesting ones where the money tends to lie. And I think there will be a migration to that. Some of the shipping work is simply rebranded as energy, and then again that seems to be operating very well. And so I don't think it's in any sense the death knell of shipping as exciting and fun, and I would encourage people to go into it. It's a lovely community, wonderful people, but there are other areas now. There's a broader spread of choice which is available to people.
It sounds very exciting. Well, we have one attendee who have raised his hand. James, are you there? Yeah, James, you can unmute yourself. You can ask your question straight away.
Sorry, that was an accidental raising, for which I apologize. But greetings from Hong Kong anyway.
But thank you very much indeed. Well, greetings to you too. I've enjoyed much time in Hong Kong too, and thank you very much for joining us. Even with the accidental raising of the hand, it's a bit like the person at the auction house who ends up finding he's bid for a rather lovely painting with resources far beyond that which he has available because he raised his hand to scratch his head at the wrong moment. But one of those moments. Anyway, James, thank you, and nice to have you with us.
All right. Well, I think we have reached the time limit, unfortunately. So we'll be consolidating the unanswered questions and share them with Duncan. And then he will send the answers back to you. Once again, thank you, Duncan, for your time, and thank you to all our participants for joining us today.
Well, thank you all very much, and many thanks to Maxwell Chambers for organizing this. It's been a great pleasure, and thank you all for joining.